What happens when two companies wire the same city with incompatible electrical systems at voltages that differ by a factor of 30 on the same wooden poles with no insulation standards, no labeling requirements, and no regulation, and the men who climb those poles to repair telegraph lines have no way of knowing which wire is carrying 110 volts and which is carrying 3,000? I found the answer in the electrical trade journals of the late 1880s. They documented a category of death that did not exist before the invention of commercial electricity, a category so new that the English language did not yet have a word for it. The journals called them cross-system fatalities. Linemen trained on Thomas Edison's low-voltage direct current, men who had spent their careers handling telegraph and telephone wire at voltages that could not kill them, would climb a pole in lower Manhattan or Brooklyn or Buffalo and reach for a wire that looked identical to every wire they had ever touched, and the current that entered their body was not the 110 volts their training had prepared them for. It was the 1,000 to 6,000 volts of George Westinghouse's alternating current system running on a wire that had been strung across the same pole by a different company with no marking, no separation, and no warning. The lineman died on the wire. The body hung above the street. The current kept flowing. And the two corporations whose competing systems had created the intersection where the man died used his death as a marketing argument against each other. The machines that built America's electrical grid were not just generators and dynamos. They were competing systems designed by rivals, installed by separate crews, strung across the same infrastructure, and the men who maintained that infrastructure were the casualties of a corporate war that neither side was willing to lose. Pearl Street, Lower Manhattan, September 4th, 1882. At 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, inside a converted commercial building at 255 Pearl Street, a chief electrician named John W. Lieb closed a switch. 6 coal-fired steam engines driving 6 massive dynamos that Edison's engineers called jumbos, each rated at 100 kilowatts, began sending 110-volt direct current through 15 miles of copper conductors buried beneath the streets of the financial district. The current traveled through iron conduit pipes 3 inches in diameter, laid in brick-lined ducts 3 feet below the paving stones. Inside those pipes, twin half-moon-shaped copper rods were separated by rope and insulated with a compound of beeswax, linseed oil, and asphaltum. The insulation had been hand-applied. The conduits had been hand-installed. The trenches that held them had been dug by work crews who had spent the better part of a year cutting through the streets of Lower Manhattan with picks and shovels, prying up cobblestones, excavating around gas mains and water pipes and sewer lines, laying the conduit, sealing the joints, filling the trench, and replacing the paving. The conduit network was the most expensive component of the entire Pearl Street project. 100,000 feet of copper wire, buried in iron pipe, insulated in beeswax, threaded through the most densely built neighborhood in the United States. Edison had personally convinced the mayor and the board of aldermen to let him dig up the streets. The politicians had initially refused. Edison persuaded them by arguing that burying the wires was safer than stringing them overhead, where they could fall on pedestrians, short against each other, and start fires. This argument would prove to be the most consequential decision of the entire project, not because it was wrong, but because Edison's competitors chose not to follow it. On the afternoon of September 4th, 1882, the lights came on in a multi-block area of Lower Manhattan. 400 incandescent lamps in 82 buildings switched from the amber flicker of gas to the steady white glow of Edison's electric filament. The New York Times, one of Edison's first customers, ran the story. By 1884, the Pearl Street station was serving 508 customers and powering 10,164 lamps. Edison had launched the modern electric utility industry. The system worked. The system was safe. The voltage was 110-volt direct current, low enough that a man could touch the wire and survive. Edison had designed it that way on purpose. The problem was that 110 volts of direct current could not travel very far. The physics of direct current power limited the Pearl Street district to roughly a quarter of a square mile. Beyond that radius, the voltage dropped to levels that could not power a lamp. If you wanted to electrify a larger area, you needed a larger station or a closer station or more copper or all three. Edison's solution to this limitation was to build more stations, each serving its own small district. The cost was enormous. The copper alone was worth more than the generating equipment. And every additional block of Manhattan that Edison wanted to electrify required more trenching, more conduit, more copper, more beeswax, and more men with picks and shovels cutting through cobblestone streets above 100-year-old infrastructure. George Westinghouse had a different solution: alternating current. Westinghouse was not an electrician. He was a railroad man. He had invented the air brake, the device that allowed a locomotive engineer to apply brakes on every car of a train simultaneously, and he had built his fortune manufacturing and licensing it. In 1886, Westinghouse entered the electrical business by licensing alternating current technology from European inventors, and critically, from a Serbian-born engineer named Nikola Tesla, who had designed an alternating current motor and a polyphase power system that could do something Edison's direct current could not. Alternating current could be stepped up to high voltages using a transformer, transmitted over long distances with minimal power loss, and then stepped back down to safe voltages at the point of use. A single generating station using Westinghouse's alternating current system could power an entire city. Edison's system could power a neighborhood. The catch was the voltage on the transmission lines. Edison's direct current system operated at 110 volts throughout, from the generating station to the customer's lamp. Westinghouse's alternating current system operated at 1,000 to 2,000 volts on the distribution lines, stepped down to safe levels only at the final transformer before the customer's building. The arc lighting companies, which had been illuminating city streets since the late 1870s, ran their systems at 3,000 to 6,000 volts. And all of these wires, Edison's direct current, Westinghouse's alternating current, the arc lighting, the telegraph, the telephone, and the stock ticker, were strung from the same wooden poles on the same streets, the same cities, crossing over and under and through each other in a tangle so dense that a single pole in lower Manhattan could carry 15 crossbars and 250 separate wires, and no lineman on that pole had any way of knowing, by sight or by touch, which wire belonged to which system or what voltage was running through it. I keep coming back to that image. 15 crossbars, 250 wires, no labels, no color coding, no insulation standards, no requirement that competing companies separate their lines or warn the men who maintained adjacent systems, a telegraph lineman, trained to handle wire at voltages that could not harm him, climbing a pole where one of the 250 wires had been crossed by an arc lighting cable carrying 6,000 volts, with no way of knowing until the current entered his body. If you want to look at these records yourself, the trade journals from the 1880s and the 1890s documented every one of these fatalities. The sources exist. The engineering reports survive. Don't take my word for it. Look at what the evidence shows, and subscribe if you want to see where the next thread leads. In the spring of 1888, people began dying on the wires. The deaths were not new. Arc lighting systems operating at several thousand volts had been killing people since the technology was introduced in the late 1870s. A man in Buffalo, New York, was killed by contact with a high-voltage arc lighting line in 1881, an incident that inspired a local dentist named Alfred Southwick to begin developing an electrical execution device based on his dental chair. The deaths accelerated as more alternating current systems were installed, the wires crossed, the insulation degraded, wind and ice knocked lines into contact with each other. The Great Blizzard of March, 1888, which paralyzed New York City under 40 inches of snow, brought down overhead wires across the city and triggered a widespread power outage that terrified residents into refusing to leave their homes for fear of electrocution from downed lines in the streets. Edison saw an opportunity. His direct current system was buried underground. It was safe. His competitors' alternating current systems were strung overhead, exposed to weather, tangled with telegraph and telephone wires, and operating at voltages that killed on contact. Edison had been arguing since the early 1880s that overhead wires were a public menace. The deaths gave him evidence. He began a campaign to discredit alternating current by associating it with death. On June 5, 1888, the day after New York State legalized execution by electricity, a self-taught electrical engineer named Harold P. Brown wrote a letter to the New York Evening Post accusing Westinghouse of placing profit above public safety. Brown claimed that the only reason alternating current companies used high voltage was to save money on copper wire, and that the public was being exposed to constant risk of sudden death so that a corporation could pay a larger dividend. Brown's letter brought him to the attention of Edison's company. Edison gave Brown access to his laboratory at West Orange, New Jersey. Brown began conducting public demonstrations in which stray dogs were electrocuted using Westinghouse alternating current equipment in front of audiences of journalists and electrical engineers. He killed a 76-pound dog named Dash before a New York City crowd and declared that alternating current was suitable only for the dog pound, the slaughterhouse, and the state prison. Edison's company, publicly and privately, supported Brown's campaign. Edison himself, while publicly opposing capital punishment, wrote to the New York State Commission recommending that if the state intended to execute criminals by electricity, it should use alternating current, specifically Westinghouse's equipment. The implication was calculated. If the state used Westinghouse alternating current to kill condemned prisoners, the public would associate Westinghouse with death. Edison even proposed a new word for death by electricity. He wanted the public to call it being Westinghoused. On August 6, 1890, a convicted murderer named William Kemmler became the first person executed in an electric chair at Auburn State Prison in New York, using a Westinghouse alternating current generator that Edison's allies had secretly arranged to procure. The execution took 8 minutes. The first jolt failed to kill Kemmler. The current was applied a second time. Witnesses reported the smell of burning flesh. George Westinghouse, when told of the execution, said they would have done better using an axe. The war of currents was fought with press releases, public demonstrations, and the deaths of dogs. It was also fought on the utility poles of Manhattan, and the men who fought it there were not corporate executives. They were linemen. October 11th, 1889, noon, the intersection of Chambers and Center Streets in Lower Manhattan, one of the busiest intersections in the city. John Feeks was a Western Union telegraph lineman. He was calm, medium height, with a sunburned face and a bristly red mustache. His assignment that afternoon was routine. He was to climb a telegraph pole and untangle a snarl of wires at one of the densest wire junctions in the city. The pole carried 15 crossbars, 9 running north-south and 6 east-west, bearing more than 250 separate wires. Feeks did not wear rubber gloves or insulated boots. He did not need them. He was a telegraph man. Telegraph wire ran at voltages too low to be dangerous. He wore metal-spiked climbing boots, the standard equipment for telegraph linemen, the spikes digging into the wooden pole as he ascended. What John Feeks did not know was that several blocks away, high winds the previous night had knocked an overhead arc lighting wire carrying alternating current into contact with one of the telegraph lines that ran through the tangle on his pole. The arc lighting line carried 1,000 volts of Westinghouse alternating current. The current was now running through a telegraph wire that looked identical to every telegraph wire Feeks had ever handled, at a voltage 30 times higher than anything his training had prepared him for. Feeks climbed the pole to the crossbars. He slipped. To stop himself from falling, he reached out and grabbed the nearest wire. The current entered his bare right hand, passed through his body, and exited through the metal spikes of his left climbing boot. John Feeks was killed almost instantly. His body fell into the tangle of wires where the current continued to flow through him. Multicolored sparks spread across his body. Blue flames, visible from the street, shot from his mouth and from his hands. The wires burned into his flesh. His body hung suspended in the wire tangle, 30 feet above one of the busiest intersections in Manhattan at the lunch hour, in full view of thousands of pedestrians. Nobody could reach him. Nobody could touch the wires. The current was still flowing. Nellie Bly, a journalist for the New York World, was on the street below and witnessed the entire event. Her account was published that afternoon. The crowd grew to thousands. The body hung in the wires for more than an hour, sparking and smoldering, while the fire department was summoned and sent to the generating plant to have the current turned off. Even the firemen, when they arrived at the pole, could not bring themselves to climb it. The body was finally retrieved after the arc lighting company cut the power. John Feeks was lowered from the pole in front of a crowd that the New York World described as standing shivering in the street, unable to look away. The New York World published its account of the death under a banner that helped coin a new word in the English language. The word was electrocute, a combination of electric and execute. The word did not exist before the overhead wire deaths of the 1880s. The English language had to invent a term for what was happening on the utility poles of American cities. because what was happening had never happened before in the history of the species. A man could touch an object that appeared harmless, and the invisible force running through it could kill him instantly, leaving no wound, no blood, no mark of violence, and the body could remain suspended in the mechanism of death for hours while a city watched. The death of John Feeks triggered what the newspapers called the electric wire panic. The New York World ran the headline, "Any moment may bring a similar horrible death to any man, woman, or child in the city." Citizens demanded that the city bury all overhead wires. Mayor Hugh Grant, who had already begun cutting down telegraph poles to public cheering, accelerated the program. George Westinghouse, who had fought legislation to bury AC wires on the grounds of expense, reversed his position and declared that alternating current would be perfectly safe if placed underground. Edison had been burying his wires from the beginning. The Edison Illuminating Company's DC system in Lower Manhattan was underground, encased in iron conduit, insulated in beeswax and asphaltum, buried 3 feet below the street. It had never killed anyone. The irony was that Edison lost the war anyway. Alternating current could do something direct current could not. In 1893, Westinghouse won the contract to illuminate the Chicago World's Fair, powering 100,000 incandescent lamps with alternating current generators. In 1896, Westinghouse alternating current power was transmitted 26 miles from Niagara Falls to the city of Buffalo, New York. That distance would have required dozens of Edison direct current stations and millions of dollars in copper. By the early 1890s, Edison no longer controlled Edison Electric. The company merged with Thomson Houston to form General Electric in 1892, and General Electric adopted alternating current. The war was over. Alternating current had won. The system that had killed the linemen had also proven to be the system that could power a continent. John Feeks was not the only lineman who died in the cross-system wire tangle. The electrical trade journals of the period documented a steady series of fatalities across American cities, wherever competing electrical companies shared pole infrastructure. The deaths followed a pattern. A lineman trained on low-voltage systems climbed a pole carrying wires from multiple companies. One of the low-voltage wires had made contact with a high-voltage AC line, either through wind, ice damage, degraded insulation, or simple proximity in a tangle that no maintenance crew was responsible for sorting out. The lineman touched the low-voltage wire he had always touched, and died from a voltage he had never been trained to expect. The companies that operated the systems blamed each other. Edison's company pointed to the AC deaths as proof that Westinghouse's system was inherently dangerous. Westinghouse's company pointed to the lack of insulation standards and maintenance protocols, and argued that the fault lay with the unregulated tangle, not with the current itself. The linemen who died were neither Edison's employees nor Westinghouse's. Many were Western Union telegraph workers or independent telephone linemen or stock ticker maintenance men. They worked for companies that had nothing to do with the power industry. They climbed poles that carried their employers' wires alongside wires from companies they had never heard of, at voltages they had never been warned about, in a regulatory environment that did not require the power companies to label their lines, separate their infrastructure, or notify adjacent wire operators of the voltages running through their cables. The linemen were casualties of a gap between two systems, a gap that both Edison and Westinghouse knew existed, and that both companies used as a weapon against the other rather than closing it. I started this story with a trade journal term, cross-system fatalities, a category of death that did not exist before competing electrical companies strung incompatible voltages across the same wooden poles. The machines that built America's electrical grid were not just the jumbo dynamos at Pearl Street or the Westinghouse transformers that stepped voltage up and down across distances Edison's direct current could never reach. The machines included the poles, the crossbars, the tangled wires, and the absence of regulation that turned every utility pole in Manhattan into an unmarked intersection between safe voltage and lethal voltage. The linemen who climbed those poles were trained on one system and exposed to another. They did not know which wire was which. They could not tell by looking. They could not tell by touching. They could only tell by dying. The conduit that Edison's crews buried beneath Pearl Street in 1882, the copper rods insulated in beeswax and linseed oil and asphaltum, sealed inside wrought iron pipe, laid in brick-lined ducts 3 feet below the street, is the ancestor of every underground electrical cable in every American city today. The AC system that Westinghouse and Tesla developed, the system that killed the linemen and powered the electric chair and lit the Chicago World's Fair, is the system that delivers electricity to every outlet in every building on this continent. Both systems survive. The men who wired them are not listed in the records of either company. The trade journals documented their deaths. The companies did not document their names. The records are still there. In the engineering archives, in the trade journals, in the municipal files of every city that was wired in the 1880s and the 1890s, we just have to open them. There are more of these stories, more machines, more furnaces, more men who went into the dark and came out different or did not come out at all. Subscribe if you want to see what I pull from the records next. If you want to see how one man's retirement project built a railroad across 128 miles of open ocean and a hurricane destroyed it in a single night, that video is on screen now.